Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share stories where the people involved believe they encountered skinwalkers. These stories include a voice calling out for help in the dark, some bizarre footprint patterns after a coyote is seen chasing cattle, and a strange acting deer on a supposedly haunted bridge. But first, we start with a story about a shrieking creature that approaches someone's backyard. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes from a poster who had a bizarre encounter in her own backyard, with some sort of shrieking creature approaching her home. She does not say where exactly her story takes place, but does say that she lives in Texas. The encounter took place some weeks before she posted her story online, and she still cannot figure out what exactly she heard that night. The original poster, or OP, was in her backyard at around 11 p.m. talking on the phone with her friend and letting out her dogs. She mentions there is a creek close to her yard and she sometimes hears coyotes in the surrounding area. There are no bobcats or cougars nearby because the area where she lives is very populated. She notes that she has either heard or seen rabbits, coyotes, raccoons, and possums, but there are some rural spots close by where bigger animals live. While she was outside talking to her friend, she noticed that her dogs, who normally bark at everything according to her, were acting very weird. Her larger dog was outside but was noticeably on guard, while the smaller dog was acting afraid and would not come outside at all. At first, the OP didn't think too much of it and carried on her conversation, but then she heard a shriek in the distance. She estimates that it was a few miles away when she first started hearing it. It was a bit difficult to hear at first, but she continued to hear it. It repeated every 40 or so seconds like clockwork, sounding exactly the same each time. She just assumed a coyote had caught a rabbit or something like that, and it would soon stop. But as it continued, she asked her friend on the phone if they could hear it as well, but they couldn't. Her larger dog, who was still outside with her, was at the fence staring off into the darkness. However, he normally barks at everything he hears, but on this night he wasn't, and it was really starting to freak out the OP. At this point, she realized the shrieking was getting closer. This made her nervous and she began talking more loudly to her friend. She was able to distinguish that the shrieking sounded like the yelping of a small dog or something close to it. At first, she thought her smaller dog had gotten out of the fence, and her first instinct was to go looking for it. But then she remembered the dog was still inside acting nervous. She started asking her friend what she should do, but then she realized the sound was just on the other side of the fence, maybe 2 feet away. The shrieking was very loud by this point, and it sounded like a person who was very good at doing impressions mimicking a small injured dog. She describes it as sounding very unnatural, unlike a coyote, a dog, or any other kind of animal. It was raspy and deep with a bass to it, but then quickly shifted from low and gravelly to a really high pitch in an instant. She was completely baffled as to how whatever was making this noise could go from miles away right up to her fence in just a couple of minutes. Her dog that was outside turned then and ran inside the house, and her friend on the phone could now hear the sound too. Not knowing what else to do, the OP started yelling and cussing at whatever was making this sound to go away, which it eventually did. After leaving the fence, it circled her neighborhood and she could still faintly hear the shrieks for hours afterward. Her friend was just as confused as she was, and her dogs would not go back out for the rest of the night. She still has no clue what approached her yard that night. I honestly can't say what I would do if I heard a bone-chilling noise in the distance getting closer, and closer, and closer, right up until it's just outside your fence. I'm not sure how or why these things choose their targets, or who they will stalk or scare or whatever it is they are up to, but to be able to do it from a few miles away? I've heard stories where cryptids notice people from incredible distances and seemingly pick them up out of nowhere. What always sticks out to me in these supposed skinwalker stories is the way the people describe the sounds. as if playing on repeat after a delay, and the delay is always the same increment in between the sounds repeating. The OP didn't mention this in her story, but the sounds in Skinwalker stories are also usually described as mechanical in nature. The other thing that sticks out to me in this story is the behavior of her dogs. For a dog that barks at anything and everything to be acting skittish and the other to refuse to even come outside, it's like when all the other animals disappear or get really quiet when a cryptid is nearby. That's definitely a sign that an apex predator is close. It's always a good idea to pay attention to your dogs if they start acting different in a certain situation, just like this. Kind of goes hand in hand with trusting your gut. As for what this being was, I know some will hear that it takes place in Texas and immediately dismiss that it could be a skinwalker. But I've said this before and I don't mind saying it again. We don't know enough about these beings to say where they can or cannot be located. They are associated with Navajo legend and lore, and the activity usually takes place in and around Navajo reservations. They are usually associated with the American Southwest due to the large population of Navajo people living in that region. However, a good portion of Texas borders New Mexico, which seems to be the epicenter for skinwalker activity. It isn't crazy to think that a skinwalker could venture into Texas or the other neighboring states. All that said though, there are other cryptids that can mimic voices and screams, so without an actual visual or description of what was making this noise, it's hard to say for sure what I think it might be. Based on the sounds alone and how the OP describes it, it definitely sounds like a skinwalker, but I can't say 100% for sure I think that's what it was. What do you think approached her yard that night? The next story comes from a poster who loves all things horror related, so she and her friend went to a supposed haunted bridge near where they live to explore and check things out. But the experience they had while there was more than either of them were prepared to experience. She does not say where her story takes place. The OP mentions that a lot of tragedy surrounds the bridge they visited that night, including a woman and her baby being hit by a train there. It is supposedly haunted and was very creepy due to it being in a remote location in the middle of the woods with nothing nearby. The only way to get to it was for them to take a small dirt road which she describes as beaten up. The bridge itself is approximately 15 to 20 feet tall and has railroad tracks crossing it. As soon as they got out of the car, the OP was hit by a heavy energy and a sensation she describes as feeling like she was being choked. She wasn't the only one either, as her friend felt this too. She says both she and her friend are spiritual and intuitive people, so them both feeling the heavy energy of that place was no coincidence, and it meant they weren't crazy. They started out standing under the bridge, but soon decided to climb the rocks lining the embankment to stand atop it. The rocks were uneven, but they were eventually able to make their way up the embankment and soon found themselves standing where the woman and her baby got hit by the train. According to the OP, it was harder for both of them to breathe when they reached the spot on the bridge, and a feeling of dread came over both of them. They were both looking around the area, and that's when the OP noticed a deer standing in the middle of the train tracks about 15 to 20 feet away. It was staring right at her and maintaining the eye contact. She says the animal's eyes looked empty and off, unnatural. She lives in the country and has seen many deer in her life, but nothing like what she was looking at in that moment standing atop the haunted bridge. What made it even weirder was the fact that they were being loud and the deer was unfazed by all the noise. She got her friend's attention, but when the friend looked at the deer, it bent down and started eating grass. Her friend looked away, and as soon as she did, the deer looked back up at the OP, meeting her eyes once again. Her friend eventually noticed this creepy phenomenon too, and the girls looked at each other with sheer terror, and the OP asked, "Is that what I think it could be?" They both decided it was time to go and began back down the hill toward their car, but the deer did not stop staring at the OP. She turned away from the deer and focused on getting back down the embankment with her friend, commenting that maybe they were just overthinking what was happening. The OP glanced back up seconds after taking her eyes off the deer, but it was gone. The forest was a good ways away from the tracks and where the deer had been standing, so she would have heard it run away and definitely would have seen it leaving with all of the ground to cover before it got to the woods. Again, the OP and her friend dismissed what was happening around them as them just being paranoid, so they decided to hang out around the bridge a little longer. They decided to go back up the hill, but as they did, a man drove his car under the bridge. They thought this was weird as well due to them being out in the middle of nowhere, but again they shrugged it off as just a weird occurrence. But the man drove back under the bridge very slowly, staring at the OP and her friend. This freaked them both out, and they knew then it was time to leave. As they were getting in the car to do so, they both felt like there was an unseen force pushing them to leave the bridge and the area behind. The man in his car was now down the road a ways, but he was sitting there watching them. She later mentions in the comments that she is unsure if the man was in any way related to the deer, but it was way too creepy of an occurrence for her to leave out of the story. She ends her post asking for anyone who comes across her story to let her know what they think about what happened to her and her friend while they were at that bridge. This is definitely a creepy encounter for more than one reason. First, there was the weird acting deer that kept staring at her, and the fact it didn't run away when they were being loud and were kind of close to it is odd as well. If the deer is used to people being around, that's one thing, but it still doesn't explain the bizarre staring problem it had. And I get that deer normally stare at people when they are nearby, but the way the OP describes it just makes it feel different. There have been many Skinwalker stories that involve weird acting deer. Also, there is how this deer just completely disappeared when the OP looked back after only a few seconds. She should have at least been able to see it running away. Then there is the random man who showed up in his car in the middle of nowhere and was also staring at them. That to me is way creepier than the deer. The thought did cross my mind, and I'm sure many of you are wondering the same thing. This guy showed up right after the deer disappeared and, like the deer, had a staring problem. Could this have been the Skinwalker back in human form? The OP and her friend definitely did the right thing by getting out of there. What do you think they encountered that night? And do you think the man and the deer are related in any way? The next story is a short one, but the poster believes they had a Skinwalker try to lure them away from their home one night. He is a Native American, and his encounter also took place on Native American land. He does not say if he lived on a reservation at the time or where his story takes place, just that he lived on tribal land. He was outside his home sitting in his parked car smoking one night at around midnight. When he was finished, he got out of his car to walk the 15 or so feet to his house. He was wearing over-the-ear headphones, but still could hear a woman's voice begin to call for help almost as soon as he got out of his car. The word was drawn out as the voice yelled it, and it was loud enough that he could hear it despite having on the headphones. He looked around as he continued toward his home, but didn't see anyone in his immediate proximity. He tried to look farther off into the darkness, but still could not see anyone. The voice kept calling out for help though, in a creepy, scary way. The OP was afraid by this point and hurried into his house, locked the door, and decided to sleep on the living room couch in front of the window right next to the door. That way, if he heard anything, he could run outside really fast and, as he puts it, handle business. But once he got inside, he didn't hear a single sound. He has no doubt that a Skinwalker was messing with him that night, but he was not fooled and would not be lured away from his home. When I read a story coming from a Native American living on Native American land, I typically believe them when they say they encountered a Skinwalker. Now, this OP didn't say that they were Navajo, which Skinwalkers are normally associated with, or where they live. But the tactic of someone yelling for help is something that is usually employed by a Skinwalker when trying to lure someone away from their home, campsite, or wherever else they might be. Luckily, being Native American and probably having heard the stories his whole life, the OP was smart enough and informed enough to realize exactly what was going on and ignore the calls for help. On that note, I will say I hope there wasn't someone out there who really needed help. Joking aside though, as soon as the OP went into his house, the voice stopped. In fact, he says he didn't hear a thing. I've heard in other accounts where cryptids try to get the attention of someone, but when that person ignores them, they stop and move on. This seems to be what happened here. What do you think about this one? And what do you think was calling for help out in the dark? The final story of this episode comes from a poster whose family had an experience when he was younger, but it never dawned on him that it could have been a skinwalker until recently. So he decided to share his story online. He does not say where his story takes place, just that he lived on a small farm next door to a cattle ranch owned by his grandparents. His story takes place in mid to late summer when he was staying with his grandparents for the weekend. It was around 11 p.m. and he was in the house with his grandmother. They heard his grandfather start calling for them, so they ran outside to see what was going on. The gate keeping the cattle inside the milk house had been left open, so the cattle had gotten out into the adjoining pasture. But this wasn't the only problem his grandfather encountered that night. He was yelling for the OP's grandmother to grab his gun because he saw a coyote chasing his cows. They eventually got all the cattle back into the milk house without incident, but the OP and his grandmother never saw a coyote. Just to be on the safe side, they called the OP's uncle to come over and check things out, which he did. When he found nothing, they all decided to call it a night. The next morning, the OP overheard a conversation between his grandfather and uncle, who were discussing the previous night's events. His uncle had gone out earlier that morning to check the fence line, and what he found makes the OP think it might have been a skinwalker that came to the ranch the night before. His uncle was following coyote tracks past the fence line into what he calls the hayfield when he picked up a new set of tracks that matched the pace of the coyote tracks and were heading in the same direction. Except they were the footprints of a human walking on bare feet. While talking to his grandfather and telling him about the footprints, the uncle dismissed it as just some guy out there walking his dog. But the OP, even though it's been 17 years, has his doubts and thinks it might have been something else. This story is certainly intriguing, and I don't hear too many like it, where there is a set of animal tracks that seemingly transform into human footprints. I'm honestly surprised there aren't more Skinwalker stories out there where this happens. But then again, people are usually more concerned with getting away from the Skinwalkers rather than following their tracks. That being said, the grandfather could be absolutely correct that the prints belonged to a man walking his dog. But why would he be out there barefoot? And from the way the story is told, the uncle makes it seem like the set of animal prints stops and then there are only human prints continuing forward. If I were the OP, I would probably question this too and be wondering the same thing, that this was something else. What do you think this was? A skinwalker who transformed while escaping the area? Or something else? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.